In the final months of World War II, the Rhine River became a wall of despair, separating the crumbling German army from the unstoppable American advance. German defenders believed the river guaranteed them time to regroup, to breathe, to fight another day. But on a cold March morning, something unbelievable rolled toward the water's edge. American soldiers climbed into strange, bobbing trucks, vehicles the Germans had never seen, never expected, and never prepared for. They looked like toys. They floated like boats. They moved like trucks. They were called ducks, but the men who rode inside them simply called them ducks. As the first duck growled into the river, German observers froze. The Americans weren't building bridges. They weren't waiting for engineers. They were crossing right now. The Rhine, the last barrier to the German heartland, was no longer a defense. It was becoming the Americans' highway. The winter of 1945 had been merciless across Western Germany. Snow turned to slush, then to thick mud that swallowed boots and vehicles alike. The forests were skeletal. The roads were cratered. And through it all, cutting across the landscape like a wound that refused to heal, flowed the Rhine River. It was not just water. To the German defenders retreating eastward, the Rhine was salvation itself. For centuries, this river had marked boundaries, protected kingdoms, stopped armies. Now, in the dying days of the Third Reich, it represented the last natural fortress between the advancing Allies and the German heartland. Officers whispered it in dimly lit command posts. Soldiers repeated it in frozen trenches. The Rhine will hold. The Rhine will buy us time. The river was wide, in some places nearly a quarter-mile across. The current was brutal, fed by snowmelt from the Alps, churning with a force that could drag a grown man under in seconds. The water was gray and cold, reflecting the bleak March skies above. To cross it without bridges meant certain death. To build bridges under fire meant suicide. The Germans knew this. They counted on it. In a small, stone farmhouse converted into a forward observation post, young German officers hunched over maps by candlelight. Their breath formed clouds in the freezing air. One of them, barely 22 years old, pressed a cigarette between trembling fingers. He had been fighting for 3 years. He had seen the tide turn at Stalingrad, watched the collapse in France, witnessed the slow, grinding retreat across his own homeland. But here, at the Rhine, he allowed himself to believe the nightmare might pause. An older sergeant stood by the window, scanning the western bank through field glasses. His face was weathered, his eyes hollow. He had fought in Poland, in Russia, in the hedgerows of Normandy. He knew what American firepower looked like. He knew what their tanks could do. But he also knew rivers, and rivers he believed were impartial. They didn't care about industrial might or air superiority. They simply existed, cold and wide and deadly. Across the Rhine, the Americans were gathering, but even they seemed uncertain, exhausted by months of relentless advance. Soldiers sat in muddy foxholes writing letters home they weren't sure would ever arrive. Some joked nervously about the crossing, masking their fear with bravado. Others simply stared at the gray water in silence, imagining what it would feel like to drown. Replacements, boys fresh from training camps in the States, arrived daily, wide-eyed and terrified. They had heard stories about the Rhine. Some had been told it was the last major obstacle before Germany surrendered. Others heard it was a death trap, that entire companies had been wiped out attempting crossings further north. The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the gray space between hope and horror. Supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition stockpiles were guarded closely. The weather refused to cooperate, grounding air support for days at a time. Morale fluctuated wildly. Some units celebrated small victories with stolen schnapps. Others buried their dead in silence, too numb to feel anything anymore.
The Germans noticed too, though they didn't understand what they were seeing. Scouts reported increased activity on the American side, movement of vehicles, gathering of troops, but the equipment didn't match any known bridging operation. There were no pontoons being assembled, no engineers laying charges to clear obstacles, no massive construction efforts that typically preceded a river crossing. In the stone farmhouse, the young officer stubbed out his cigarette and lit another. The older sergeant lowered his binoculars, squinting into the distance. Something felt wrong. The Americans were too quiet, too organized, too deliberate. As darkness fell on the eve of the crossing, both armies settled into an uneasy tension. The Germans manned their positions, checking fields of fire, preparing artillery coordinates, convincing themselves the river would hold. The Americans huddled in their staging areas, cleaning weapons they hoped they wouldn't need to use, checking life vests they prayed would keep them afloat. And in the cold March night, covered by tarps and shadow, the ducks waited. Dawn arrived slowly, reluctant, as if even the sun was hesitant to witness what was about to unfold. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Frost clung to the grass. The Rhine flowed on, indifferent to the tension building on both its banks. American soldiers were roused before first light. No hot breakfast, no time for the usual morning routines, just orders, whispered and urgent. Fall in, gear up, move out. They stumbled from their bivouacs, breath steaming, muscles stiff from cold and exhaustion, and then they saw them. The tarps were being pulled away. Military police stepped aside, and there in the pre-dawn gloom sat the strangest vehicles most of these men had ever seen. They were trucks, clearly, 6 wheels, a cargo bed, a driver's compartment, but something was profoundly wrong about their proportions. The hull was too high, too rounded. The body seemed to sit on top of the wheels rather than around them, and the whole thing had a peculiar, ungainly appearance, like a child's drawing of a truck brought awkwardly to life. Laughter rippled through the ranks, nervous laughter, confused laughter. Someone shouted a joke about the motor pool sending them toys. Another soldier wondered aloud if this was some kind of mistake, if they were supposed to be loading supplies instead of climbing inside. But the officers weren't laughing. They moved through the groups with grim efficiency, organizing squads, assigning vehicles, checking manifests. And slowly, the reality began to sink in. These weren't supply trucks. These were their ride across the Rhine. A sergeant explained it quickly, without ceremony. The vehicles were called DUKWs, amphibious trucks. They could drive on land and float on water. Each one could carry 25 men in their equipment. They had been tested, they would work. The men needed to trust them. Trust them. The phrase hung in the cold air like a challenge. A private from Ohio stared at the duck assigned to his squad. He walked around it slowly, inspecting the hull, the wheels, the strange propeller mounted at the rear. It looked flimsy, vulnerable. The metal seemed too thin to stop bullets, let alone withstand the Rhine's current. He thought about his father, a riverboat pilot on the Mississippi, and wondered what the old man would say about trying to cross a river in a truck. Another soldier, a replacement who had arrived only 3 days earlier, felt his stomach tighten into a knot. He had been terrified of drowning since childhood. Lakes, pools, even deep bathtubs made him anxious. And now they wanted him to ride a truck into one of the most dangerous rivers in Europe? He gripped his rifle tighter, knuckles white, and tried to remember the prayers his mother had taught him. The nickname helped, strangely, ducks. Someone said it out loud, and the word spread quickly. Not DUKWs. Ducks. It was absurd. It was almost comical. And in that absurdity, some of the terror eased. Not much, but enough. Across the Rhine, German forward observers were beginning their morning watch. The older sergeant had not slept. He stood by the window of the farmhouse, binoculars pressed to his face, scanning the opposite shore as dawn spread across the landscape. Movement. Lots of movement. Vehicles rolling toward the riverbank in organized columns. He called for the young officer. They watched together, trying to identify the equipment. The vehicles were clearly trucks of some kind. American trucks probably carrying troops or supplies. But why were they moving directly toward the water? Repositioning maybe. Evacuating wounded. preparing a staging area for bridging equipment. And then the first duck reached the water's edge and didn't stop.
The sergeant's breath caught. The truck drove directly into the Rhine, front wheels splashing into the gray water, then the rear wheels, the whole vehicle tilting slightly as it transitioned from land to river. And then, impossibly, it was floating. The wheels churned, the propeller engaged, and the truck was moving across the water like some bizarre hybrid creature, half vehicle, half boat. The sergeant lowered his binoculars, raised them again, stared harder. His hands started shaking, but not from cold. The young officer grabbed his own glasses. He saw the second duck enter the water, then a third, then more, forming a ragged line across the river. Engines growling, wakes spreading behind them. He felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. Not fear, not yet. Something worse. Realization. They were crossing, right now, without bridges, without pontoons, without any of the preparations the Germans had expected, had planned for, had based their entire defensive strategy upon. The Americans were simply driving across the Rhine, as if it were a muddy road. The young officer shouted for a runner. Orders needed to be relayed. Artillery needed coordinates. Infantry needed to be alerted. Officers needed to know that the crossing had begun and that it was happening in a way nobody had anticipated. The runner sprinted from the farmhouse, boots pounding against frozen earth. In the German trenches, confusion spread like wildfire. Soldiers rushed to positions, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Some thought the vehicles were boats disguised as trucks. Others insisted they were seeing decoys, that the real crossing would come elsewhere. A few veterans, men who had seen too much war to be surprised by anything, understood immediately. The Americans had done something clever, something new, something that changed everything. Inside the lead duck, Private First Class Michael Kowalski gripped the side rail so hard his fingers ached. The transition from land to water had been jarring. The vehicle lurched, tilted, then settled into a rhythm as the wheels found purchase and the propeller took over. Water sloshed over the sides, soaking boots, flooding the floor. The engine roared, straining against the current. Kowalski had been in combat before. He had stormed beaches in France. He had fought through hedgerows and forests. He had seen friends die. But this was different. This was a new kind of terror. In a firefight, you could shoot back. In a trench, you could dig deeper. In a tank, you had armor. But here, floating in a glorified truck in the middle of a freezing river, with artillery starting to boom in the distance, there was nowhere to go. No cover. No escape. Just water and sky, and the desperate hope that the engine wouldn't quit. Around him, other soldiers hunched low, trying to make themselves smaller. Some clutched religious medals, others sang quietly, the same verse over and over, clinging to familiar words. One man vomited over the side, his body betraying the calm expression he tried to maintain. The squat sergeant shouted encouragement, but his voice was tight, strained, barely audible over the engine and the wind and the growing sound of gunfire from the far bank. The current pulled at them. The duck drifted downstream, the driver fighting to keep it pointed toward the opposite shore. Other ducks flanked them, bobbing in the water like oversized bath toys. One tilted dangerously as a wave from a nearby artillery impact rolled beneath it. For a moment it seemed certain to capsize. Soldiers inside screamed, grabbing for anything solid. But the duck righted itself, engine sputtering but still running, and continued forward.
In the trenches, arguments broke out. Some soldiers wanted to retreat immediately. Others insisted on holding, on fighting, on making the Americans pay for every yard. A few simply sat down, rifles across their laps, staring at the river with blank expressions. The psychological barrier had broken. If the Rhine couldn't stop the Americans, what could? Back in the ducks, the terror continued. Kowalski felt every second stretch into eternity. The far bank seemed impossibly distant. The water seemed impossibly wide. His legs were soaked. His rifle was slippery with spray. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. But they were getting closer. The German shore was no longer a vague line but a real place, detailed and approaching. Trees, trenches, defensive positions. And beyond them, Germany itself. The interior. The heartland. The end. The duck's front wheels touched bottom. The vehicle lurched, climbing from water onto mud, transitioning back to land. The driver gunned the engine. They were across. Kowalski stumbled out, boots sinking into German soil, rifle up, scanning for targets. Around him, other soldiers poured from ducks, forming up, pushing inland. More vehicles were arriving every minute, dozens of them, an unstoppable stream of men and machines flowing across the Rhine like a dam had burst. German resistance crumbled. Some units fired a few token shots before retreating. Others surrendered immediately, hands raised, faces showing relief more than defeat. A few positions held briefly, but they were isolated, surrounded, overwhelmed by the speed and scale of the crossing. The young officer in the farmhouse watched his defensive line dissolve. He had been promised the Rhine would hold. He had believed it. He had staked his life on it. Now American soldiers were spreading across the eastern bank like a flood, and there was nothing he could do. The older sergeant beside him simply shook his head, set down his binoculars, and began gathering his few possessions. The war, he knew, was over. Maybe not officially, maybe not for weeks, but spiritually, emotionally, strategically, it was over. By midday, engineers were bringing equipment across in more ducks. By afternoon, pontoon bridges were being constructed, adding to the flow of men and material. By evening, the Rhine crossing was not a desperate gamble, but an established fact. The river had fallen. The barrier had broken. The road to Berlin was open. In the days that followed, the full scope of what had happened began to sink in. American commanders reviewed reports with something close to disbelief. The crossing had succeeded beyond expectations. Casualties, while tragic, had been far lower than projected. German resistance had collapsed faster than anyone dared hope. The ducks, those strange, ungainly, often mocked vehicles, had proved themselves in the most dramatic way possible. For the men who had made the crossing, the memories remained vivid and complex. Some spoke of the terror openly, describing the feeling of helplessness as they floated across the Rhine with artillery falling around them. Others refused to talk about it at all, locking the experience away in whatever mental compartment they reserved for the war's worst moments. Private Kowalski wrote a letter home 3 days after the crossing. He tried to explain what it had been like, riding a truck across one of Europe's greatest rivers, but the words felt inadequate. How do you describe terror and triumph existing simultaneously? How do you convey the surreal absurdity of the situation? The ducks, the crossing, the German faces as they realized what was happening. In the end, he kept it simple. We crossed the Rhine. It was bad, but we made it. I'll tell you the rest when I get home. The German soldiers who had witnessed the crossing carried their own burdens. For some, it was the final proof that the war was lost, that further resistance was pointless. For others, it was a source of bitter fascination. They had been beaten not by overwhelming force, although that existed, but by innovation, by ingenuity, by a solution so unexpected they had no counter for it. Historians would later debate the significance of the Rhine crossings. Some would argue they were inevitable, the German defeat was already certain. Others would point to the psychological impact, the way the ducks transformed a massive natural obstacle into something crossable, achievable, almost mundane. The Rhine had been a symbol, a hope, a last stand, and the ducks had erased it in a morning. But for the men who rode inside those vehicles, the significance was simpler and more immediate. They had faced their fear. They had climbed into strange machines and trusted them with their lives. They had crossed a river that was supposed to be uncrossable, and they had survived.
The Duke itself would go on to become one of the war's unsung heroes. Designed by committee, tested in secret, initially dismissed as too weird to be useful, it proved invaluable across multiple theaters. It landed supplies on invasion beaches. It crossed rivers throughout Europe. It served in the Pacific, moving cargo from ships to shore across coral reefs and through surf that would have swamped conventional boats. But its moment of greatest impact, its moment of genuine historical drama, came on that cold March day at the Rhine, when German defenders, desperate for time, for a pause, for anything that might delay the inevitable, watched their last natural fortress become a highway. When American soldiers, terrified and determined, rode trucks into a freezing river and came out the other side on enemy soil. War is not glorious. It is not adventure. It is fear and mud and exhaustion and loss. But within that darkness, moments of human achievement shine through. Moments when ingenuity triumphs over obstacle, when courage overcomes terror, when ordinary people, pushed to extraordinary limits, do what needs to be done. The Rhine crossing was one of those moments, not because of the generals who planned it or the engineers who designed the ducts, but because of the soldiers who climbed inside, who gripped the rails with white-knuckled fear, who rode across the gray water with artillery falling around them, who stepped onto the far bank and kept moving forward. They didn't cross the Rhine because they were fearless. They crossed it because they were afraid, and did it anyway. They crossed it because their friends were beside them, because they believed it would bring the war closer to an end, because surrendering to fear meant surrendering to hopelessness, and that was the one thing they refused to do. The ducks gave them the means, but the men provided the will, and in the end, it was will, human will, fragile and fierce, that bent the course of history that day. The Rhine still flows, of course, wide and cold and gray, cutting through the heart of Europe. It remains a significant river, a boundary, a feature on maps and in guidebooks, but it is no longer a fortress. It is no longer the barrier it once was. Because on one March morning in 1945, American soldiers rode across it, in trucks, and the world changed.